So, have you ever forgotten to add an ingredient when you're baking? Are there a lot of bakers here? Anyone like baking? It may be just as bad if you put an extra ingredient in and you're not supposed to. Like if you've ever been making brownies and you accidentally put nuts in and can completely destroy the entire batch. Okay, again, show of hands. Who's pro nut in your cookies or brownie? I'm going to pray for you. Seriously though, if you've ever been baking and you forgot an ingredient, like maybe you forgot to put in some sugar when you're making pancakes or something like that, or muffins or something along those lines. I did the opposite one time with salt. I misread the instructions, and I don't know if it was supposed to be like a half teaspoon of salt, and I put in like a half cup or something. I'm making biscuits. It might have been like 2 tablespoons. I don't know what it was. Whatever it was, you noticed it. It tasted like there was way too much salt in it. But if you miss an ingredient, or if you add an ingredient, it's not going to turn out the way you want it to. Do you ever feel like you're missing an ingredient for God? Do you ever feel like there's a part of you that's missing? Like you see how others have been and you want to be like that, but there's something missing. And I don't want us to get in the mentality of putting someone else on a pedestal. Like I have a lot of heroes of the faith, even ones who are alive today, not just from the Bible, and I tend sometimes to put them on a pedestal, and I've seen a number of times how faulty they can be, and it hurts. At one time, a few years ago, it was like all these guys who I held up as like, oh yeah, I want to be like that guy, and all of them were like crumbling. And there's the few who are left, I'm just like, please, don't cheat on your wife or something, because I need someone to look up to. I know nobody's perfect, but at the same time, you see how God has used other people, and you want it, and you wonder, what's the secret? What am I missing? What is it? Why is it that this guy can write, book after book after book, and just, it's like amazing that God is just using him, or this woman is just writing, song after song after song on a worship album after worship album, and you think, how is it that God can use these people so effectively, and why them and not me? Am I alone in that? Has anyone else ever felt that feeling? Like there's just, like they've got something that I don't have? I think that there's one key ingredient that makes a difference in God using you to be a great man or woman of God. And we're going to talk about that this morning. We've been doing a series called The Giant. And this is the story that we know as David and Goliath. And it is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Like David is like my favorite character in the whole Bible other than Jesus. He's sort of like the default one. But if you look at somebody who's not God incarnate, it's got to be David for me. And a lot of this is like, when I was a little kid, I was kind of small, believe it or not. I was kind of a smaller kid. And when you read about David, you find out he's not the biggest, he's not the strongest, but he was like an amazing character. Like he was a warrior. He was a man after God's own heart. And there was just something special about him that God used him in amazing ways. And I always loved reading his story. Now last week I intentionally didn't mention his name. We just did the first part of the story, and that first part of the story is all about the giant, all about Goliath. But we talked about how he isn't the real giant in the story. I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't 9 feet tall. We went through all that, the history of why I believe he actually was as tall as the Bible says, but he wasn't the real giant in the story, and that the real giant in the story is God. And that when we tend to look at, just with human eyes, we see things on one plane without realizing that there's a huge, gigantic, universe-creating God who's on our side and wants to save us. But today we're going to bring in a new character, my favorite character, a great man of God. And he was flawed and imperfect. And that's, in some ways, one of the reasons I also like him. I mean, sometimes you look at people in the Bible and you think, like Paul. Paul sometimes frustrates me. And I know he had a history and a past, but he also it's like I don't feel like I could ever live up to be like Paul. But then when you look at David and you see some of the things that he did, it's like, okay, well, as long as I don't, commit adultery with my best friend's wife and kill him, I'm probably, not as bad as David in some ways. And yet, he's a great man. He's a great man of God, and God used him to do amazing things. And today we're going to talk about the key ingredient that God looks for, and that you can also add to your life so that God can use you. So today we're starting in 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting verse 12. So if you've got your Bible, you can look at it. I'm using the New Living Translation, which is what I usually read from. It says, "Now David was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah." Now, an Ephrathite, at first I was looking at this and saying, does that mean he's from the tribe of Ephraim? But it's not. It's Ephrathite, or Ephrathah and Bethlehem are kind of like two words for the same place. It would sort of be like someone saying, this guy is from Pembroke, but he's also a valley boy. It's sort of the same type of idea. And David was the son of a man named Jesse. Jesse was an old man at that time, and at that time just means in the time of Saul. The time that the story is taking place, saying Jesse was an old man. And the word for old man here might mean like he's an old guy, or just simply might mean that he's somebody who's at the age where he is too old to go to war. He might not be ancient, he just means that his days of fighting are beyond him. And he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shemiah, or sometimes Shema, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. And so I went with the Hemsworth brothers, because that's sort of who I picture in this scenario. Eliab, the Bible tells us, he was tall and handsome and strong, and he was the kind of guy you would look at and be like, any young man would be like, I want to grow up to be like Eliab. And it doesn't really tell us much about Abinadab or Shammah, but you sort of think they're all these strong warriors going to battle with Saul. But David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army. And so we're starting to see already here this contrast. On the one hand, we've got Eliab and Abinadab and Shammah, strong warriors, the oldest 3. And on the other hand, you've got David. And we know that David, from other passages, was not big and strong. He was handsome, but he wasn't the Hollywood leading man. Verse 15 says, David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. The role of a shepherd was usually reserved for the youngest. It was not generally considered to be a position of honor. In that culture, being a shepherd was actually, people looked down on the shepherds. They'd be like, oh, okay, you're a shepherd. I get it. And David went back and forth. It wasn't enough that he was like the lowly shepherd. He was also sort of like the errand boy. And I was sort of wondering to myself, there's a whole bunch of other sons. How come Jesse's sending David? And we'll come back to this idea in a moment, but I don't think Jesse made the decision to send David. I think God did. But imagine this scenario where the 3 oldest boys have gone off to war, and Bethlehem is not that far away from where this battle is taking place. And so you can imagine these 3 young, strapping men, the king's going to war, and they're like, I'm joining him, because if the Philistines get through Saul, our place is next. Like we're just down the road. And so we're going to go fight with the rest of the army. We're going to be heroes. Let's go do it. And David sort of left at home, goes back and forth, being an errand boy. And for verse 16, it almost seems like it's out of place here, but it kind of makes sense. It's for 40 days. Every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. And so we talked about this last week, this idea that this giant character, this huge man in probably shining armor, stands in front of the army of Israel, taunting them, giving them this challenge, saying, why don't you send one man down to fight me? He and I will fight, and whoever wins will win the day. Not everyone has to die. You don't all have to die. Only one of you has to die. That's kind of what his challenge was. But what's interesting here is that this is going on for over a month. You can imagine these young men going off to war, getting ready to go to the battle, going down to the front the first day, and thinking today's the day. Today's the day the battle's going to happen. And then this huge giant comes out and stands in the way, issues the challenge, and then no one goes to war. No one goes to fight. And then you go back to camp and you sort of sit there, probably in shame, realizing that we are all afraid. This guy, even our king, the one he's our giant, he's head and shoulders taller than everybody else. He's the one who should go down and fight him. He's hiding in this tent. And so you're filled with just like this fear and trembling and shame, and you're just, every day you come down to fight, and then every day you run away. And eventually it gets to the point where you think, even if we do go to war, we're not going to have any heart in this. We're just embarrassed to be here. And imagine what it's like to be back home. Jesse sends his boys off to fight, thinking, okay, well, one way or another, this is all going to be over soon. They'll be home or they'll be dead. And 40 days goes by, and they haven't seen them. So one day Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers." In some ways he's thinking, you know what, they've been gone a long time and they're probably running out of food. We need to take care of our soldiers at the front. And he's sending a lot of food. This basket of grain isn't just like this little tub. It's like enough to feed like 10 men for a while. And 10 loaves of bread, and carry them quickly to your brothers. Give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. This is kind of Jesse's way of saying, you know what, I'm going to do everything I can to make things as good as possible for my sons up at the front. If I give their captain a gift, maybe they'll be nicer to my boys. See how your brothers are getting along, and bring back a report on how they're doing. This is what this is really all about. He's sending David to go take care of these things, but really he wants to know. This is a dad who loves his kids and is worried about them. He says, yeah, take all this stuff, but bring home something more valuable. Tell me how they're doing. Let me know that they're all right. And then again, this almost seems like it's redundant, but David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Kind of like this reminder, that's why they're there. That's what they're supposed to be doing, and yet they're not really doing it. And so David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts that as Jesse had directed him. This tells us a little bit about David's character. He has a heart for looking after others. If he didn't care about his sheep, he wouldn't have left them with anybody else. He'd be like, sweet, I get to get away from this job that nobody wants. I get to go see what's happening. I'm leaving right away. I'm going to do it. But no, he's conscientious. He takes care of his sheep. He looks after the thing that God has given him to look after. And he doesn't, say, oh, I'll get there eventually. He leaves early the next morning. So he's taking care of all this in advance so he can do the job that his dad's given him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. And so, imagine you're in David's sandals, I guess. You get there and you think, oh, okay, today's the day. I didn't realize, I don't know what's been happening for 40 days, but today's the day we're going down. He doesn't know necessarily that every day this is happening and every day he has to, they walk back in shame to their tents. But he gets there and think, oh, today's the day. And they're going down with shouts and battle cries. I don't know if you've seen the movie Braveheart, but they line up on either side of the field and they sit there and they beat their swords and spears together, and they make a loud noise. They try to intimidate the other team or the other army. In the Civil War, there was a thing called the rebel yell, and as they would go to battle, the guys in the South, they would all do this like, yeah. You ever watch Dukes of Hazzard? I know I'm dating myself with that one. It was one of my favorite shows when I was a little kid, but they did this like the Dukes yell. They go, yeah, that was the rebel yell. And so as you go into battle, all these guys down, like every part of the army would be just screaming, yeah, we're not afraid of you. We can't wait to fight. And so they're all geared up and getting down there and going to the battle. And David arrives right when this is happening. And so, he's thinking, oh, today's the day. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces, they were stood facing each other, army against army. They're getting ready to fight. David left his things to the keeper of the supplies. Again, conscientious, not just dropping them where they are. He makes sure they're taken care of. But he hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. Today's the day that they are going to war. Today's the day they might die. I got to see them before they go. It takes incredible courage for a young man. We don't know exactly how old he was. Some people think he was probably 15 or 16. Old enough to be like somewhat of a teenager, somewhat of a man, but certainly too young to fight, and yet he's running right into the battle lines to see his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. And then David heard him shout his usual taunt, to the army of Israel. So everything's been happening. David doesn't know this. He thinks today's the day. The Israelites are getting themselves all riled up. They're going down there with the rebel yell. And then the same thing happens that's been happening for 40 days. But there's one difference. There's one difference today. That's that David hears them. Up until this day, we don't know if David was ever aware of this or not, but today's the day David hears them. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Terrified again, right? This is running away in fear and shame, and David's probably trying to figure out, what's happening. I thought today was the day. He's heard what the giant has said. Everyone else has heard what the giant has said, and they've run away. They start talking. And the sense here isn't that they're talking to David, they're talking to each other. And David sort of overhears this. He says, "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. I mean, that's kind of a silly question to ask. 40 days in a row, of course they've seen the giant. They're running away. But it's almost like they're trying to talk about maybe something that's kind of new information. He said, "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." This is huge. But it also tells us that things have gotten so bad that Saul, who is afraid in his tent, is trying to do anything he can to create some kind of incentive for someone to go down and do the job that Saul should have done himself. And he's saying, if you do this, I'll sort of welcome you into my royal family. And maybe even more important, your entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. I mean, this is not just like one man and his kids. This is like your entire clan is going to be exempted from paying taxes. This is a huge financial incentive. And the men are sort of talking about it, like maybe this is kind of new. Yeah, we've seen the giant, but is it worth it? Is it worth the risk to fight that giant to get this incredible reward? But again, something's different today. David has heard what the giant said. David's heard what the men have said. David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" You see the difference in what's being said here. On the one hand, you've got the soldiers talking about, this giant. On the other hand, you've got David, who sees him not as a giant, but just a pagan Philistine. The actual text says uncircumcised Philistine, because for them it was like all tied up in this religious thing. But David's saying, you know what? He's not someone who belongs to God. Yeah, on the one hand, you guys see a giant. I just see somebody who doesn't belong to God. On the one side, they say, this Philistine who's defying Israel, this giant who's defying Israel. On the other hand, David's saying, who is this man who defies not just Israel, but the armies of the living God? And again, these soldiers are seeing everything on face value. David is seeing things on a higher plane. I see an uncircumcised Philistine. I see a pagan, someone who doesn't belong to God. And he's defying not just us, but he's defying God. The men are talking about this huge reward you're going to get. And what does David says? What will a man get? Not the reward for killing this Philistine, but ending his defiance of Israel. It's almost like David is saying, you guys are kind of caught up in all this other stuff. The real reward is that we're going to end his defiance of Israel and of God. All the other soldiers are seeing things on the earthly plane. David is seeing things from a different level. He's recognizing that God has a role in this, and that God is on our side. That there is a giant on the field, but it's not Goliath, it's God. And he's on our side. And the men seem to completely miss this. These men gave David the same reply. They say, yes, that's the reward for killing him. Almost like saying, did you not hear us correctly? And then comes Big Brother. When David's oldest brother, Eliab, Chris Hemsworth, this handsome, tall, strong warrior, when he heard David talking to the men. And it's not just that he's the older brother. I mean, the fact that Jesse is an old man at this point, it's almost like he's become, in some ways, the patriarch of the family. He's become the leader of the family in some ways. And now David is talking. And when Eliab hears David talking, he becomes angry. He says, "What are you doing here anyway?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." Now some people think that because Goliath is a giant and is therefore the champion, then someone who is big on the Israelite side should go and fight him. Probably should have been Saul because he's head and shoulders above everybody else. But what do we know about Eliab? He's also quite tall. And some people think that maybe Eliab is angry here because he feels like David's pushing him forward, and he's not quite ready to go forward. Personally, I kind of think Eliab's projecting. He is trying to diminish David. Look at the way he talks to him. "What are you doing in here anyway? You don't belong here. What about those few sheep? You're nothing but a shepherd. You're not important. I know about your pride and your deceit. You just want to see the battle. There's a problem with your character, David." But again, I think he's projecting. I think he's looking at himself and saying he feels insecure. Maybe he feels like he doesn't belong himself. He's shamed, along with all the other soldiers, about running away every day. He doesn't have the courage to fight this giant. He doesn't have the faith to fight this giant. Maybe he feels insignificant. He's the big brother at home. He's sort of in charge of the family, but here he's just a small fish in a big pond. There seems to be a problem with Eliab's character. And I think the answer to what that might be, we see that actually a chapter earlier. See, 1 Samuel chapter 16 tells the story first of how David comes onto the scene. And Saul has been the king for a while now, but Saul keeps messing up. And Saul has turned his back on God. Saul has trusted not in God anymore, but he's trusted himself, and he cares more about what other people think than what God thinks. And God has just rejected him as king. And so he tells Samuel, he says, "I want you to go and anoint someone else to be king. Someone who has a heart for me, someone I've chosen." And so Samuel goes to meet with David's family, and David doesn't even rank high enough in his own family to be considered. And they all line up in front of Samuel, and Samuel's supposed to look at each one, and God's going to tell him which one it is. David's still out tending sheep. He doesn't even come on the scene until after. But as soon as Samuel looks at Eliab, as soon as he sees this strapping warrior man, he says, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." I mean, what's the prototype? Saul. Saul was handsome, Saul was tall, Saul was strong. And so when Samuel looks at Eliab, he just sees, oh, did I say Samson? I said Saul. Sorry. Saul is when Samuel looks at Saul, he sees a king. When Samuel looks at Eliab, he sees a king. Surely this is the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." It's like he's saying, I've already done that. We've been there, done that with Saul, and that's not what I look at. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so we see that there must be a flaw with Eliab's character. Something in him, something in his heart that God says, I've rejected him. I rejected Saul for good reasons. I'm rejecting Eliab for good reasons. And he goes all the way down the line, looks at Abinadab, looks at Shammah, looks at some of the other brothers whose names we don't even see in this passage. Finally, they bring in David, and God says, that's the one. That is the man who has a heart that's after my own. That's the one I want you to anoint. Yeah, he's small. He's not what you'd look at for a king. What's on the inside is what really matters. And so we see this comparison. First of all, we saw this comparison between Goliath and Saul. Now we see this comparison between Eliab and David. So David responds, he says, what have I done now David replied. "I was only asking a question." And he walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. Now, the wording here sometimes is difficult to understand, but in some ways he's sort of saying, okay, and I can totally picture a younger brother saying this. Like, what have I done now? Come on. I am a younger brother. This is the feeling of somebody who's been picked on and just feels like things are unfair. Like, oh, now what have I done? Can I even talk? Can I even speak? And I think there's something to that. But there's also, in the King James Version, it says, "Is there not a cause?" Which doesn't translate as well for us today. But really what he's saying is it's almost a double meaning. Can I even speak at the same time? Don't I have a right to speak to this? Because am I not right about what I'm saying? Is there not a cause to be spoken? Why aren't you speaking, Eliab? Why aren't you the one who's saying, this pagan Philistine is defying the army of Israel, the army of the living God? This isn't about me, this isn't about you, this is about God. And he is being offended. Is there not a cause to rise up and try and get people to realize this? See, David is not focused on the giant on the field, he's focused on the giant of the universe. He's focused on God. And that's the difference. That's the key ingredient. David has the key ingredient that Eliab, that Saul, that so many others lack. God seeks out and strengthens his servants who have sincere hearts. God seeks out and strengthens his servants who have sincere hearts. 2 Chronicles 16:9, the first part says it this way: "The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him." If you've ever looked at someone else and thought, what do they have that I don't have? How come God is using them in a way that he's not using me? Ask yourself the question, is God strengthening you because your heart is fully committed to him? See, I think that's the difference. I think God takes people and uses them in a special way, because their hearts are completely, we use words like on fire or totally sold out, fully dedicated, things like that. God looks for people like that and he says, I want to strengthen you. I want to use you. I want to do great things through you. So turn your heart fully to God. God seeks out and strengthens his servants who have sincere hearts. So if you want to be a great man or a great woman for God, if you want to be strengthened by God to do great things for God, completely surrender your will to him. Let the Holy Spirit control your life. Read his word. Find out what he wants from you. Spend time in prayer. Get to know God in such a way that when his voice speaks, you are able not just to hear it and understand it, but to obey it. See, I said earlier, I didn't think that it was necessarily Jesse who was sending David. I think it was God. Because you and I never know when the opportunity to do great things is coming. You never know what's around the corner. David has no idea when his dad sent him on an errand that God was getting ready to do a great thing through him. You have no idea when you step out the door what God might be preparing you to do. You never know what's going to happen at work on Tuesday, or next Friday, or next weekend. You never know. You never know what's coming, but God knows it. And if you have the key ingredient that David had, this heart for God, to be a servant of God with a sincere heart, if you follow God with a sincere heart and surrender yourself completely to the will of the Holy Spirit, I believe God will use you to do something great for his kingdom. Gene, will you come up and pray for us?